Okay, so the spinning disks we've been watching in experimental sonic machines are an example of this category of storage using spinning disks to store binary information. There's a long history of this kind of device. We've seen Babbage's use of punch cards technology in his analytic engines, and you've seen the Jacquard loom for weaving textiles. We saw IBM's Hollerith machines using punched cards for storing data and for doing big data analytics in the 1890s for the US Census. And then we saw punched paper tapes being used in Bletchley Park. This is the Colossus machine. You can see the paper tapes streaming around, containing very similar binary information to what we see here. Some of these punch card technologies are still used by at least one UK local government, so I've heard. I'll not name the particular local government. This kind of storage is usually used for what we now think of as secondary storage. This is an example of a spinning disk, a spinning magnetic hard disk being used as secondary storage. So in terms of the memory pyramid, this is going to sit around here. It's going to sit beneath the RAM, but above these really big offline storage methods like tape backups. So typically secondary memory then, again, it's used for storing and retrieving digital information. This time it is non-volatile. You can turn these devices off and the data is still there. And they're characterized by capacity and performance rather than the raw speed that we find in the RAM levels. So most of our desktop computers are still using magnetic spinning disks. So these are a pretty simple evolution of the disks we can see right here. They're related to gramophone records, to vinyl records. A magnetic spinning disk, just like the music we see here, is divided into tracks. Here we see the tracks are used for containing information about the different kinds of drum hits, the different bass lines. On a magnetic disk, the tracks can be used for storing any pieces of data. The tracks are then subdivided into sectors. The sectors are like the containers of the individual beats that we can see on these spinning disks, or perhaps individual bars on the larger spinning disks. So a magnetic disk is going to spin very fast, something like 5,000 to 15,000 rotations per minute. Nowadays you can have multiple disks. Here's an example with 3 disks, and each one has its own head. This head is functioning very similar to the lollipop readers we've seen here. Again, it's related to gramophones and to vinyl recording methods. So here's the layout of your hard disk. Here you see the multiple tracks. Here are the sectors within each track. Each sector is formatted in a particular way. The sector contains a header saying which sector it is, or giving you some clue about where you are on the disk. Then there's the data itself, and then again you're going to have some of this error-correcting information. This is redundancy built into the representation, so that if the disk is damaged, you can partially restore some of the data that you see there. The headers are needed to synchronize things, so you know where you are as the disk is spinning round. Where am I? Where should I move the head to go and read? So typically a sector nowadays is going to be about 512 bytes. Each sector has a unique address on the disk. This is a different kind of addressing from the addressing in RAM that we've seen. So the layout of your data on the disk is important. It's going to affect how long it takes to read and write data. You have a physical head, like the heads we've seen here. This kind of head, like on a gramophone, can move in and out, so you can choose which track is being read. So if you're moving from data stored on the outside of the disk to data on the inside of the disk, that's going to take time for the head to move. This is called the seek time. There's another component of access time called rotational delay. This is the time it takes for the disk to spin round for the sector that you're interested in to reach the head. So if you're working at this level, if you're writing device drivers for hard disks in operating systems, or dealing with data in big data centers, doing machine learning that has to be fast, you need to think about how to lay your data out on the disk so that all the data you want to read together is in a contiguous set of sectors. Typically then we're going to read at least one sector, usually a whole bunch of sectors at a time. It's fast to read a whole bunch of sectors all into RAM. Remember, there's the same kind of relationship you see where RAM is going into the lines of cache. you're always trying to make use of these locality effects so that when you do your caching to the next level, you bring a load of stuff that is spatially close together. There is some redundancy built into the sectors of the disks. We saw the use of these error-correcting codes. When you work for a real company with valuable data, or even in your own home, if you have valuable data, you may want to add extra layers of redundancy as well as the redundancy that's already in the sectors. You'd like to make your system resilient to a crash of a complete hard drive. The disaster case is when the head of the hard disk crashes into the spinning disk and destroys everything. So to be resilient against the total hard disk failure, we have methods of using multiple, what are called redundant arrays of independent disks. You just take a whole bunch of commodity hard disks and you put them together, usually in the same physical unit, and you're going to split your data up in ways that have redundancy, so that if one of these fails, there are copies of it somewhere else. You'll come across different versions of this. It's called RAID, for redundant arrays of independent disks. Lots of standards have been proposed. The main two you will come across are called RAID 1 and RAID 5. RAID 1 is simply making a complete backup of your disk. You put the same pieces of data, A1, A2, A3, A4, in the same places on 2 or more redundant disks, so that if this disk fails, you can go and look for it on the second disk. This is also useful for applications where a lot of people are asking for data at the same time. If 2 users dial into this server and both want to read A3, it means one of them can take the copy from one disk and one can take the copy from another disk, and you're getting more constant use out of the disks. A more advanced version of this is known as RAID 5, and it uses the concept of file striping. So here we take one file. In this case, the file A has been split into 4 pieces, and this time we're going to lay out different parts of the same file across the different disks. Okay? And RAID 5 defines a protocol for error correction, where in this case we're using 3 disks to store 3 parts of the file, and then there is error correction information stored on the 4th disk, so that if any one of these disks goes down, you can recover the contents. There's 1 disk's worth of redundancy has been built into the system. So here, file B has been striped across, file C has been striped, and file D has also gone across. So this can give you speed-ups for a single user. If you're just working with file A and you want to read in the whole of file A at once, instead of having to read it all off of 1 spinning disk, you can read different parts of file A from 3 spinning disks all at the same time. More recently, things have started moving away from spinning disks. We now have what are called solid-state drives. These are not drives in this sense of the word. There is no disk in an SSD drive. They're called drives because they've been designed to be compatible with historical hard disks. So they're built with the same form factor and the same interface. So you can swap one of these in for a spinning hard disk in your computer. But really, this is just a bunch of flash memory. This is the ROM that we saw earlier. And you just fill this physical container with as much flash ROM as you can, and you use it as if it was a spinning disk hard drive. So this is nice, of course, because it has no moving components. It should go faster. It can be more resilient to physical shock if you drop your laptop on the floor. Until recently, at least, it's been more expensive, but things are generally moving this way. Generally, we like to make things that are electronic and don't move over mechanical systems where more things can go wrong. SSDs, they can also have a longer lifespan. There's no mechanical wear happening here. They're less susceptible to physical shock and vibration. If you bang the table with a hard disk on it, bad things can happen. We're lowering the power consumption because we're not physically making things move. We're reducing the noise being emitted from moving parts. And we're using less energy, so things are cooler. There's no heat being generated by the moving parts. So secondary storage then it's storage that can be used to implement virtual memory. We've seen you've got your registers at the top, you might have a cache, you might have a few caches, you have your RAM, then you have your secondary storage. And if you're running an operating system, anything on secondary storage can be made to appear as if it was in the main address space. The virtual memory created by your operating system makes the data on the disk appear as if it was part of RAM. But there's that caching step, called paging in this case, that gives you a delay when you go out and read things. So a piece of data, it can be sitting on your hard disk, it can be sitting in this virtual memory, it gets requested by a program, and it will move through the caches. It will get paged off the hard disk into RAM, it will get cached off the RAM into level 3 cache, it will go through the level 2 cache to level 1 cache, and then into the register. So just doing a read of memory on a modern computer is a pretty complex process. You can have 5 levels of caches that are all initiated when you do a load instruction in your assembly language. When we get to tertiary and offline storage, we're moving away from that model. We're moving to memory that isn't addressable in that sense. This is memory that is used for longer term archival storage. We can make a distinction between what is called tertiary storage, which is storage which can be brought online reasonably quickly, whatever that means, maybe in a few seconds, and data that is genuinely archival that can be unused for weeks or years, or even longer. So now we're moving into the era of cloud computing and big data and data centers. This stuff has become very important. If you're using, say, a social network, you probably have half your life's worth of photographs are stored in the cloud. This is what the cloud actually looks like. This is where your family photos are being stored. We're seeing huge architectural creations devoted specifically to hosting data. These are buildings that are not designed for people to inhabit. They're designed for data. These are related to but different from computing centers. Later in the module, we'll talk about massively parallel computing, where you want a building full of computers that do computation. A data center is a slightly different beast. Its primary purpose is to store data, not to perform computation on it. These are data archives. So you'll see these centers run by companies like the social networks, by search engines, and especially by financial institutions, by governments. This is an example of HSBC Bank's data mine. It's at a top secret location right next to junction 35A of the M1. And I figured this out because it's quite close to where I live. I drive down this road sometimes, and you see these are air ducts. These are giant air ducts. When you see these are a giveaway sign. There's something under the ground that is generating heat. This is what a data center looks like. Remember, all the energy, the heat loss we've looked at coming from all those transistors has to go somewhere. So HSBC have taken over a former coal mine near Barnsley. There's lots of former coal mines near Barnsley. And they've repurposed it as this secure data storage center. This is packed full of machines. You can infer somewhat what people are doing there. There's a lot of people who live close to this area who work either for HSBC or for Capgemini, seem to have some involvement in it. And they're not allowed to say what they do, but they all have the same kind of certifications on their LinkedIn profile in cloud computing and data storage and so on. So you put this together with seeing these tubes, and it's pretty obvious what's actually going on here. This kind of storage is designed to be nuclear warfare proof. If World War III kicks off, we can all be bombed back to the Stone Age. Only bacteria even may survive, but HSBC and their buddies will still have all your mortgage and student loan data, and they will still come for you after. So, closely related to this idea of storing very important data is how do we store data for a long time? So we still have the equivalent of student loan records from the Mesopotamian period. This is a clay tablet from 1800 BCE. Actually, this particular one's showing Pythagoras' theorem, quite a long time before Pythagoras' life. It was discovered much earlier than that. It's got rows of calculations of squaring things. But it's somewhat worrying. You can go to the British Museum and see tablets like this that have survived for thousands of years, and it's worrying. How can we store our data with this kind of durability? The systems that we see now, the systems in that coal mine, you can see there's lots of lights on here, there's lots of spinning disks, it's consuming electricity to keep the thing going. How long would this really last at an archaeological level? How do we really make things for posterity is an ongoing issue. We can look at slightly more recent technologies that have survived, so that the wax cylinder was created in the 1880s. There are still recordings here. This is an early version of a vinyl record. You take a piece of wax, which is malleable, and you can record into it. The physical movement of the air in the sound wave will create an analog representation on the wax, which you can then play back. So you can just about dig these out from 1889 and replay them. They're very crackly and scratchy, but they have successfully stored data for 100 odd years. But they're degrading. Because they're analog in particular, they degrade gradually. So we've moved to digital disks. We've seen the magnetic disks, the hard drives. There was also a period of floppy magnetic disks. You used to put them in your floppy disk drive to boot your 8-bit video games. Optical disks were designed to be somewhat more durable than magnetic storage. An optical disk is encoding data via small pits. This is really just the modern version of the clay tablet. Okay? To store data on a clay tablet, you just carve notches into it. The stone is either up or down. And it's exactly what you do on an optical disc. You make little tiny pits on the disc. And we've been through various iterations of this, starting with the CD. These pits have got smaller. As the pits get smaller, you need laser light with shorter wavelengths to read the smaller sizes. That's why the colors of the lasers have changed. That's why we now have Blu-ray. This is working on a blue wavelength, which has a shorter wavelength and is able to work with shorter pits in the magnified disc than the CD or the DVD. So optical rotating discs have been through several stages of evolution. We started with the compact disc in 1982. This was originally designed as audio storage. It was specifically designed to be long enough to store Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, because the executive of Sony, I think, like Beethoven, he says our new standard must be at least capable of storing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So it ended up with this 60 minutes of audio standard for a long time. So a warning to history can be found in what was called the laser disc that came after this. Anyone seen one of these before? Okay, this is from a 1980s project called the Doomsday Disc, and the original Doomsday Book was created here in just after 1066 by William the Conqueror. He made a list of everything in Britain, and it was supposed to be the definitive guide to at least the ownership of all things British. In the 1980s, which I think was an anniversary, maybe it was 1086 or something when the Doomsday Book was first done, they decided to do the modern version of this called the Doomsday Disc Project. They said, we're going to represent the entirety of Britain, everything in society and community and economy, and we're going to represent it for posterity. So like with the Doomsday Book, in 1,000 years people can come and see what Britain was like. So they took the BBC Micro, or the BBC Master, as a slightly enhanced BBC Micro, and they added these giant laser discs to it. It's about 4 times the size of a CD or DVD. And this thing could store 600 megabytes, which at the time was insanely huge. You were talking about floppy disks with a couple of 100K on them for everything else. And they created this standard to be very durable and to stand the test of time, so that in 1,000 years people would dig them up and understand British history in the 1980s. And within about 10 years, they became unreadable. Okay? So the discs themselves were fine, but the technology for reading the discs was lost. They were only ever used for this one application, pretty much. They didn't catch on as a consumer product. And not so many people wanted to buy a Doomsday Disc reader because all you could use it for was reading the Doomsday Disc, which was kind of interesting for a couple of weeks, but you got bored of it quickly after that. And so these reading machines began to die out. They would break. A lot of them were being moved around between primary schools. They were getting damaged in those tours of the schools. And within about 10 years, there were none left. And so this whole history of Britain that was supposed to be stored for 1,000 years of posterity just became completely unreadable. It's only in the last few years someone's managed to reconstruct one custom machine to do it and transferred everything onto the internet. So if this thing does survive for posterity, it's going to survive on the internet in one of those data centers in a coal mine. probably on spinning consumer hard disks with lots of redundancy and lots of backups, rather than on this highly customized one-off device that was created for the single purpose. You know, there's a lesson here. The consumer technology will usually win. It may not be as technically advanced, but if there's more of it and it's cheaper, you throw resources at it, that's how you can build up more reliable storage. So anyway, we continued to evolve the CD. So the CD was originally an audio thing. It became the CD-ROM, read-only memory, in 1988. So this is a disk that could be burned. People would talk of burning a disk. At least when we got to the home recordable version, which was CDR and CDRW. The CD-ROM was one you had to buy, CDR was one you could burn yourself. And there was a time through the 1990s when you'd build your music collection by burning your own audio CDR discs. They used to be gold. You'd have a collection of gold home-burned discs. You could go to the library and make copies of library recordings which were Creative Commons licensed, and therefore it was legal to make copies of them. And then we got to the DVD, which is a higher capacity version of the CD, initially called the digital video disc, then renamed as the digital versatile disc to indicate that it isn't just for storing video, it's a general data storage medium. This can take you up to around 17 gigabytes. If you use both sides. And we've seen first burnable, recordable versions and then rewritable versions. And of course, the latest evolution of spinning disks, we've gone all the way from this kind of Babbage style pieces of paper with zeros and ones. Now we have the Blu-ray, which is being used primarily for very high definition video and home entertainment. So a single layer on a single side of a Blu-ray can take you up to 25 gigabytes. How many bits fit on one of these? It's about 100? About 100 bits?
I think the little discs, I can fit about 32 notes on a resolution. The bigger one, 64.
Okay, 64 bits. Yeah, we can get 25 gigabytes or 25 Gebi bits or something on a modern Blu-ray. Okay, if we want even bigger storage capacities, if you're the likes of a social network and you're trying to host everyone's family photographs in the whole world, you're going to go to archival methods. So this is called an optical jukebox. This is the Sony Everspan. It's being used as the back end of at least one major social network. So imagine this sitting down a coal mine in a secure data center. So what you have here is a robotic jukebox. It's like the old jukeboxes of the 1950s. There's a robot arm that will go and bring out a Blu-ray. It'll insert it in the machine, spin it up for you in a couple of seconds. So one of these, this whole unit installed will take you up to 200 petabytes, or equivalently 1,600 pebby bits. Okay, exercises convert all these numbers into SI units when you get home. So you'll sometimes see on a site like a social network, there might be a small delay. If you go and pull out a photograph from 12 years ago that no one's accessed in the whole 12 years, that isn't going to be stored on a regular hard disk. It's going to be archived in one of these. You'll notice a few seconds delay, and that's the time it takes for the social network's robot in a coal mine somewhere in America to load up that disk, shove it in, and bring out your old family photos for you. So, in addition to disks, we've also had tapes. The tape player was well known in the 8-bit era. This is before we had the floppy disks. You would use the same magnetic tape that is now used by hipster bands to try and look like authentic 1980s hipster bands in their audio recordings, and which sounds absolutely awful because they're really noisy. But for some reason, those people like it anyway. I was there in the 80s and we had tapes and they sounded awful. Don't be all nostalgic about them because they were rubbish. Anyone being nostalgic about them probably wasn't there at the time. But you could use the same technology to store digital data. Again, as with the disks, using the magnetic states, you can magnetize things either north or south, up or down. These had a very characteristic sound when they were loading. Anyone from the 8-bit area will recognize the sound of a computer tape put into an audio player by accident. Less well known is that magnetic tape is still very much alive and active today. It's used for offline archiving, for company backups. You can take machines like this, like linear tape open format. This will give you a tiny cartridge with something like 12 terabytes on it. It's much more spatially efficient than a spinning hard disk. It'll give you a very long lifetime. Maybe these things will last for 20 years. And they're nice because the tapes themselves are very cheap. So if you work for a company in a small office, you could, for example, buy one of these, you buy 20 tapes for it, and every day you take a complete backup of everything the company owns. The whole company's computer world fits on a single tape. And then you can rotate the locations of those tapes. You might have 10 employees who each take it in turns to hold one of the tapes at their house, their domestic residence. And maybe a couple of versions in an off-site backup facility. So if your office burns down, even if your office burns down and 3 of the staff members' houses are burgled all at the same time, there's always one of these very cheap tapes that is circulating. Downside of it is your staff can then run off with all your company's data because you've enabled them to take it home. So there's a bit of a trade-off. You might want to encrypt it first. But none of these technologies are really getting us to this ideal of 10,000 years storage. We still don't really have anything like the Mesopotamians had that people in the distant future can pick up and read. And this is a worry for a lot of people now. You know, what will happen to your data when you die? You've spent your whole life building up this amazing and probably fictional version of yourself on social media, but where's that going to go if the social media site doesn't want to host it anymore? Or how will you keep your family photographs and your bad poetry and your bad research papers and everything alive for your great-great-grandchildren? There was a recent suggestion that we should stop printing out great memes of the 2010s on paper and bundling them into time capsules and bury them under the ground, because nothing we have currently is able to store this stuff like that for posterity. Anything in a data center is reliant on power coming in and IT people maintaining it and keeping the disks spinning and keeping the lights on. The tapes will last a little longer. A tape will last for 20 years. Still not great. There are several research avenues. One avenue is using DNA. So we know, for example, we can store seeds for very long periods. There's a place called the International Seed Bank, somewhere in the Arctic Circle, where they keep a copy of the DNA of every species of plant they can get their hands on. So after World War III destroys everything, you can retrieve varieties of wheat and strawberries and restart humanity and civilization from it. But you can also use DNA to encode arbitrary information. If you can find parts of the DNA that aren't being used by the plant, this is called junk DNA. It's the majority, we think, of most DNA. You can store your own data in and amongst it. You might want to take a plant, genetically engineer it to contain all your social media photographs, grow a bunch of them, and then put their seeds in a seed bank. Or you could even keep them growing. You could release these things into the environment, and your data would be preserved through the growth of life. Or you can go for precision artificial storage method. So this is the modern version of the clay tablet, right? This is three-dimensional glass laser nanostructuring. It's currently being researched at the University of Southampton. The idea is you're going to take a 3D chunk of material and you're going to manipulate almost at the individual atomic level, flipping the states of the atoms in there to store your zeros and ones. And because it's three-dimensional, instead of just being a disk, you can fit a lot of data in there. And it also makes it very secure because most of the data is physically contained inside this 3D structure. It's away from anything that could damage it. So the Southampton team reckons they can fit about 350 terabytes into a square inch cubed with a 14 billion year lifetime. This would be the same as the age of the known universe. So this remains an active research area. Maybe you want to encode your social media life onto DNA. Maybe you'll get to encode it onto three-dimensional glass crystals. Maybe when you're buried or cremated, they can bury this little crystal along with your skeleton for someone to discover in 10,000 years. While we're waiting for these technologies, if you do want to survive for 10,000 years, your best bet is still to get a big lump of rock and just carve things on it. This is what humans have done for thousands of years, called gravestones. Thank you. See you next week.